Harvard has so much to lose, and it is so embedded and so much at the peak of the commanding heights that it is in no way interested in submitting. The church-state struggle is always interesting, but it's most interesting when the state suddenly represents the will of the people, and the will of the people is against the elites, the aristocracy, and the church, the tyrannical church or despotic church. Certainly, the commanding heights of academia are despotic.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It's a beautiful spring evening. The Thames is quiet. The centurions are hanging around as they do when the weather's good and the light stays with us. None of that winter time, close down, go home stuff. And Germanicus and I are enjoying the headlines from the 21st century. And we also enjoy the idea that the academy in the 21st century is the same academy here in the 1st century AD. How do I say that? The Roman Academy believes that we, equus class, the ones who have the property and earn the money, although the Greeks work for us, we owe the academy a living, a very good living, by the way, and complete protection, no outside source to interrupt their studies. That's the 1st century AD under the emperors of Rome. In the 21st century, it is not profoundly different. We will explore that. We begin, however, with headlines from the 21st century. Hard to predict these headlines, Germanicus. So I read them off from London. This is the Telegraph, knowing that the Telegraph, long associated with the Tories, that ancient party that no longer exists. Right. The Tory Telegraph likes hot headlines. And these are pretty hot. We start in the morning, this morning. 9:06 a.m. London time. Mr. Zelensky says Moscow has begun to consider ending the war. This is Kiev speaking. 30 minutes later, Mr. Trump in Washington says it's a great day for Russia and Ukraine. 3 hours later, Turkey, Ankara, Mr. Erdogan weighing in, an unusual choice for an arbiter. Mr. Erdogan ready to host peace talks in Istanbul. Always the Eastern Empire, Germanicus, always the Eastern Empire. Something magical about Constantinople after all these centuries. And 2 hours after that, Mr. Putin ignores calls for Ukraine's ceasefire. That call came from a collective of the European Union's powerful states. I saw Britain, I saw France, I saw Germany, all gathered together in Kiev to support the idea of a ceasefire. And 3 hours after that, Ukraine should agree to Putin's meeting immediately, says Mr. Trump. That is what you call a loud hint to Zelensky. Go to Istanbul. We're looking at opera, Germanicus.
Yes.
The keen detail here is that since we last talked of these matters, there's been a victory parade in Moscow, maybe a little premature, but another victory parade, the 80th anniversary of the close of the Great Patriotic War. You're all puzzled why May 8th is VE Day and May 9th is the parade, because the treaty for the surrender of Germany was signed at such an hour in Europe that it was 1 a.m. in Moscow. So Moscow decided, well, we'll celebrate both of them. But in any event, the twist here, Germanicus, that I must mention to the audience.
Yes.
Oh, and this is a live twist. We're not anywhere close to understanding all of these machinations, but it's what we have right now. What we know is that Mr. Putin was standing next to Mr. Xi. Also in attendance was the largest state in the Americas after the United States. That would be Brazil. Lula da Silva was present, the president of Brazil. And the illegitimate dictator of Venezuela, Mr. Maduro, was present. There are other figures on the dais, but the significant one is the biggest state but America in the Americas, the biggest state in Eurasia but India, and the Mr. Putin celebrating his victory in 1945 or in 2025. There you have it, Germanicus, a rich tapestry that you anticipated some time ago. Is this a surrender by Zelensky ordered by Trump, or are we talking about weeks of double talk? Good evening to you.
Good evening, guys. The world historical harmony or disharmony of the spheres is grinding toward the moment of no return, the moment of apocalyptic revelation, and the moment of ultimate realization, decision. And that is that Europe and the US have been putting off the ultimate final decision over Ukraine. And everything that Mr. Trump has done has been to try and thread the needle in ways that really are not possible. In other words, he wanted to leave behind the idea of a continuing war against Russia, which was turning into a calamity for the West and is already one for Ukraine, by creating some kind of halfway house where the US and by extension Europe could exit the war in a decorous manner without any sort of visible ritual of shame, as attended the US departure from Afghanistan or the US final departure from Saigon in 1975. The idea of a ceasefire followed by negotiations is a way to make it appear that the U.S. is, along with the gaggle of vassals, of course, in Europe, the U.S. and its vassals are still equal to Russia in terms of their weight and authority at the bargaining table, and that as equals they can meet and then they can come to an agreement. And Putin will have nothing of that, for the very simple reason that any ceasefire will lead to a long negotiation period, protracted, extended as long as possible while Ukraine arms up. And Russia is not willing to do that when it is, in operational terms, so close to a final decision. And it also creates an impression that Mr. Putin, by implication, comes to the negotiating table not at the request of Mr. Trump, but at his command. And that, too, preserves the impression to the world that the U.S. is still in a position, to use the charming metaphor of the American president, holding the cards. But the U.S. holds no cards in this war. And Mr. Putin wants to see the war resolved on Russia's terms, because that's what Russia, then the Rus, expect. That's what they need. They want a settlement. They want a situation that will end the possibility of future wars in what used to be part of their own patrimony not so long ago. And so this is a situation that is somewhat fraught, because Russia, having essentially stonewalled, which is a rejection in so many terms of the idea of a ceasefire and negotiations on the American terms, that it will inevitably lead to a situation where the U.S. and Europe will have to find a way to accommodate to a visible defeat, and that may lead to an escalation again. If Mr. Trump feels that he has been dissed, that he will lose face, that he will be seen as the man who lost Ukraine, and of course that is silly, but that nonetheless this becomes an issue when it's clear to everyone that this entire war was not merely a bridge too far, but a disaster taking the form of what they call a slow train wreck for 3 years. So it's a moment that could go different ways. And I'm not so sure that Mr. Trump's going to be able to accept finding himself as the representative of a defeated coalition. That's a tough thing to swallow. And of course, Europeans are deathly afraid of that, because the defeat of Europe means the defeat of NATO and probably the end of NATO. So it's a parlous moment. And if the president decides to extend sanctions, which is a small but serious form of escalation, that could lead to more escalation, and it's rather worrisome. So we'll have to see what happens. But the ball is really in Trump's court now.
On the table will be the maximum demands that we've heard for some time. They won't invent new ones. That would be the Donbass, perhaps including Kharkiv, perhaps not, although there was some sense that it would not ask for all of Zaporizhia and Kherson, since they occupy very little of it. Definitely Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, definitely. Also asking for Ukraine not to join NATO. Also asking for Ukraine to disarm and denazify. Those have been repeated for years, again and again and again. And it strikes me from the outside looking in, Mr. Putin can make those insistent demands. We're very familiar in Kyiv. And if Mr. Zelensky does this, then that. If he does this, then that. In other words, the pressure will be on Zelensky. The Europeans are asking him for a ceasefire. Washington is asking Zelensky for a ceasefire. Putin will come with his demands. Zelensky says, yes, there's a ceasefire. Zelensky says, no, there's no ceasefire. Is it more complicated than that?
Well, in one sense, you're quite right that Mr. Putin is boxing Mr. Zelensky into a corner where he's likely to react spasmodically, right, and thus further his loss of authority and thus strengthen Putin's hand. But I think what's interesting here in terms of how Mr. Putin has presented his demands. I mean, the goals or objectives of Russia are for a settlement, and the settlement necessitates a much smaller Ukrainian military that does not receive NATO sustenance and reinforcement. That's the real key, because the great fear in Russia is that there'll be a ceasefire and Ukraine will start replenishing, and then if there's any kind of settlement, then Ukraine will just continue to arm up the way it did in the 8 years before the current high-intensity war, during the low-intensity war since 2014. So I don't think that Russia is really in a position to give up on its minimum demands, and these are minimum demands. A maximalist demands for Russia would include Odessa and Kharkov and that sort of demand. I think the best road for Russia now, and it's a difficult one, but I think it's doable given the fact that they've built up 2 extra armies, would be to put Ukraine on the battlefield in a position where it's going to break. And that will, I think, encourage the United States imperial court and Mr. Trump to find some way to come to an agreement that satisfies the demand on demilitarization, which is really it's a reduced force. It's the same thing that the Allies did to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, or that Germany did to Vichy France. And it is the only path toward a peaceful settlement. And if it looks to Washington as though Mr. Putin is in a position to do whatever he wants, that the Ukrainian army is about to break and Russia to break through, well, then I think that will motivate people remarkably. And that would probably be the most positive path to a settlement, because the alternative would be a complete shameful collapse of everything. So this is I think the best pathway ahead for Mr. Putin, and it does speak well of him as a negotiator. That, as I said, he's put forward his minimum demands in a very canny way, namely that he's saying, "Look, here, this is as reasonable as I can get, and if this isn't acceptable, well, then I'll take more, and I can, and then we'll be in a totally different situation." And I think that is where he gets his leverage at the moment, and I think it also helps to explain why he's been relatively slow in his approach on the battlefield. There's several reasons for that, of course. Russian casualties being one, but that could change if it's necessary to make something happen, to bring about an end to the war, to move it quickly into a termination phase.
Is the war potential in Kashmir a factor here of getting this settled? We only have, one war at a time, Mr. Seward. However, right now, my dance card has 3 wars and I'm topped out. I imagine that's the same in Moscow.
Well, I think Moscow, Beijing, and Washington are all concerned about India and Pakistan. However, I have to say, all of the wars, and there have been several of them, depending on how you count, and they've all been limited. They've all pulled back from the brink, and they're not even at the brink right now. It seems to me to be a kind of pas de deux, a kind of jockeying for, I don't know, I'm not bragging rights. It's much more serious than that, but they're involved in a dance that I don't fully understand. And yet it is worrisome because, of course, the prospect of escalation is always there. And there are lots and lots of very spirited, even hot-headed Indians and Pakistanis who would be more than happy to just, let slip the dogs of war. So we're at a funny point there as well.
Does Kiev get the fact that it has a chance to get out of this, and that taking the other way will get it applause from the hawks, but will make it the problem? Does it understand that it's the risk here is it's going to become the problem? I've lost you, Germanicus. We'll come back. We'll find Germanicus. He's momentarily not across the table as he was before. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're coming home to America. The Academy is unhappy. Why and what is to be done? I'm John Batchelor. Friends of History Debating Society, I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. Beg pardon for the interruption of our live stream. It turns out we do not understand everything about how we can be in the 1st century AD and spend time criticizing the 21st century and every century in between. We don't understand the mechanism. And so once in a while we get caught in different centuries. I was comfortably in the 1st century, ending the first conversation about the 21st. And it might be that Germanicus was still in the 21st century. We don't know. We're Romans, Equus class. Greeks work for us. We'll ask the Greeks. And speaking of Greeks, this is an opportunity for Germanicus and I to reflect on something that really does not touch our lives. I am not an academician. I was trained to be one, but I am not. Germanicus can speak for himself, but he now and again evidences too much time in education, not enough time in the pool hall. Okay, that's enough. So both of us have a familiarity with the Academy. We were both in versions of the Academy once upon a time in the 1st century AD and in the 20th century AD. We know both. And it is not a surprise to us that the Academy is making noises. Some would say the word squealing, not I. I say making noises about the changes in Washington. And most recently, there's been a challenge to the #1 academy, the equivalent of, say, Aristotle tutoring Alexander and his best general Ptolemy, once upon a time. That's Harvard University, the Aristotle of academies. Harvard has decided to fight the federal government. That might be the wrong word. Resist? No, that's not right either. Confront, repudiate, challenge. Germanicus will help me here. And in the event, quite a contrast from Columbia University that I'm familiar with because I spent many years in that library. Columbia University is bending the knee, is obeying the order of the central government to change its ways when it comes to tolerating anti-Semitism and teaching what you'd have to say is good old-fashioned anti-Americanism in some of its courses. Harvard University, however, through its academy and through its spokespersons, is saying academic freedom, we will not, we will resist, we will not make changes, we will challenge you in court. Germanicus, I go back and forth in this. On some days I think it's a bad idea, on other days I think it's even worse than that. Harvard is fighting the central government. The challenge is about money, follow the money. Research grants, extensions of loans, fellowships over the years. It's a big number. It gets bigger depending on who's telling the story. I add in here, it's all not about Harvard. Other universities are resisting as well. The one I follow most closely, however, is the resistance at Science magazine. That is the #1 peer-reviewed high-end magazine in America for scientific endeavor. It's a joy to flip through it and not understand the headlines. But in any event, the scientists have decided to join in the general acclaim for those who are resisting the federal government's order. In the sciences part, it has to do with a magic formula called DEI once upon a time. To explain it is to get lost. I'll just say, if DEI shows up in your fellowship, your grant, your conversation, your notes, your website, you're asked to remove it. And if you do not remove it, you lose your grant. It's that simple. Harvard University has other complications because of the demonstrations of 2024. So I come to you, Germanicus, with a simple question. It's rhetorical, but it's simple. Do we owe them a living? Thank you.
Lenin was not as full of insight as he thought he was, but he did have a very potent insight that was necessary to voice at the end of the 19th century, and that's his concept of the commanding heights. And essentially what he was referring to were the ruling institutions of any constitutional order. And all those ruling institutions are part of a kind of a whole, ruling class interconnections. And the state is only one of those institutions. And therefore, it's incorrect to look at the state as if it was something on its own. And if we were to look at the U.S. since World War II, and especially in the last several decades, we see the commanding heights as being a kind of unitary authority. Not exactly a monolith, certainly, but a group of institutions, only one of which was the state. And together they exercise power and authority. They are the source of legitimacy in our society. And yet, being a democracy, the people somehow got it into their minds that they didn't like this arrangement where they were completely subservient to and unable to protest against or resist this force, which is colloquially referred to often as the deep state, but it's much more than the state. And so if we're to look at other societies in times past and try and understand what the high academy, which of course are the ruling universities of the academic network in the U.S., those universities are really most similar to the church in earlier European societies. And so the church, for example, in Ancien Regime France, was one of the three estates, and it was integrated into national life, and it was extremely wealthy because it received money. It was one of the forces of power, certainly all through the Middle Ages and then into the Enlightenment and up to the French Revolution. And the church was also the same kind of power, say, in Tudor England. And there was a famous confrontation between the king, a certain Henry VIII, and the church in England, and the church lost. And of course, there are some resonances to what is going on today. But yes, the church has great wealth, and that wealth has always been both dependent on and expecting income from the state. In other words, the state would be in many ways subservient to the church and ensure that it was properly funded and that it had church properties and its own forms of political power and influence. So this is what I think we're seeing today, is that there is a challenge to the ruling institutions in American life made by the people with Mr. Trump as their voice, but not necessarily the source himself, but rather still, in all that notwithstanding, the representative of this desire to, if not overthrow the commanding heights, at least level them a bit so that they are not the rulers of our society. And there is tremendous resistance to that. And Harvard has so much to lose, and it is so embedded and so much at the peak of the commanding heights that it is in no way interested in submitting. And when I say peak, that's similar to the cliche, a hill to die on, because clearly they would rather have a last stand than give in at this point. So the church-state struggle is always interesting, but it's most interesting when the state suddenly represents the will of the people, and the will of the people is against the elites, the aristocracy, and the church, the tyrannical church or despotic church. And certainly the commanding heights of academia are despotic in the way in which they rule. And that despotism is clear. It's clear in the three letters that you enunciated, DEI. It's a form of control over people, and it's also a wicket that one has to pass through if one wants to become a member of the American counterpart of the equus class or senatorial class. And it's also the basis for imposing its will upon the people. You know, the as the Greeks would call them, the hoi polloi, or the populares, as the Romans termed them. This is an ancient struggle, and simply because it's clothed in different raiment, and of course the raiment isn't really that different. If you see an academic procession in one of its great rituals of convocation, like graduation, they're all of them, all of the august senators of academia are wearing robes that are very similar to the robes and vestments of, say, bishops or cardinals.
Do they understand it, Germanicus?
No. In fact, there is a complete incapacity to stand back, and of course that makes perfect sense, because to stand back means to step outside of yourself and then look at the deeper structural framework of the world you inhabit, and not just that world, but its power relationships, but more than that, the sources of one's own legitimacy and one's own beliefs. And that is almost impossible for people to do in a culture. And it is ironic only in the sense that the men and women of a place like Harvard are supposed to be people of such great intellectual strength of insight that they, among all humans, should be the ones who can step outside of themselves, step back, and see themselves for what they are. But alas, that is not to be.
We owe them a living. No, we do not. For the moment, the living is not available. It'll come back. These things come and go. However, it is a good lesson in assuming too much. Very good lesson. We're in the 1st century AD, firmly now. And we want to stay here for a moment because I apologized to Germanicus before we began our conversation today. I accidentally started to read Plutarch. It's always a sin. I understand. And not just Plutarch's Lives of the Romans, but Plutarch's Lives of the Greeks and Romans. When he compares and contrasts, mostly contrasts, the noble, virtuous Greeks and the rascalry Romans. And so when we come back, I'm going to take one of those rascals, Pompey the Great, and ask the counterfactual question. What if Pompey had lived? What would we be in the 21st century? We're going to entertain the possibility that Pompey had lived on that shore of Egypt and not died at the hands of a upstart who was working for one of the Ptolemy plotters at the time. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt since Alexander's death. Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III were very good kings. Macedonians ruling an Egyptian land, understanding the religion, the idols, the ceremonies, the processions, and integrating more than we know the ability of the Macedonian, the Greek, the Hellenistic world with the ancient Egyptian world. However, when we got to Ptolemy 12, 13, 14, 15, this is Cleopatra's zone, Cleopatra the seventh zone. Things went awry. And Pompey landed on the shore after his defeat by Octavian and Caesar and was murdered. And for some reason, Ptolemy thought that if he sent the head to Caesar, they all would be forgiven and they'd work together. Didn't work out that way. However, the counterfactual is, what if Pompey had not died on that shore? What would Caesar have made of him? Pompey was a very admirable man. He was the son of Strabo, an admirable man who contested with Sulla, not an admirable man. But in any event, we're talking about a famous family. All Pompey had ever done for Rome is win on the battlefield and do what he was asked to do. He wasn't especially greedy. He wasn't especially ambitious. He had married correctly, Caesar's relative. He was a man who could have had a career completely in another direction, but he chose to contest Caesar and contest for the Republic. He lost that battle. I do not believe Caesar had in mind executing him. Caesar looked on Pompey as a brother warrior. So I come to you, Germanicus, your thoughts. If Pompey had lived, would they have shared the empire? Would Pompey have predominated? Because Caesar was an upstart in comparison to Pompey's successes.
Well, proceeding from your question about had Pompey lived, there is a corollary and necessary second question, which is, would Caesar have lived? And in that sense, had Caesar lived but been subordinated to Pompey in some working way, meaning he had been sent to some distant province to govern and was no longer considered a viable contender, which is a remote possibility. But let's say that something like that is the outcome, or even Caesar dies in the battle. that begs the question of how Pompey would have prevailed on the battlefield of Pharsalus. And that's difficult because even though Pompey's army of about 38,000 completely outnumbered Caesar's 22,000 and had a huge advantage in cavalry of 7-1, Caesar anticipated Pompey's moves. And of course, that speaks to Caesar as a battlefield commander because he knew Pompey. I mean, Pompey had been married to Julia, for example. I mean, he showed remarkable acumen and skill in that battle in defeating Pompey. And one asks why? Why did Pompey, who was, after all, called Pompey Magnus, and had fought in every part of the emerging Roman Imperium, how did this happen? I think part of it was that Pompey had not been fighting for the last several years and had perhaps not as sharp a set of skills the moment he began to engage Caesar in a campaign. And you have to remember that Caesar had been fighting in Gaul, which was a remarkably stressful and demanding campaign, and its success was in no way prefigured by the fact that the Romans were there under Caesar. It was not a sure thing by any means, and yet he did prevail. And so he was at the height of his powers. And we have to also think about the moment in which Pharsalus occurred, because it was only 5 years after the death of the other triumvir, Crassus, at Carrhae. And so in a period of a few short years, 5 years, had gone from a triumvirate to a battle between the two remaining triumvirs, which would settle the fate of Rome. And so had Pompey won, one might expect that it would have been different in the sense of his relationship with the Senate and the senatorial class. He was, after all, their leader in terms of the campaign against Caesar.
He had celebrated. The Republic celebrated Pompey.
They celebrated him, and he had a great relationship with the senators. And so my feeling is that had he survived, the Roman Republic would have survived in a nominal form for another period of time. And that period of time would be the period of time before Pompey died. In other words, there'd be this kind of final breathing space in which a titular republic still existed, because Pompey, unlike Caesar, would be unlikely to move in the direction that Caesar did, which was moving toward total control. He would have conducted things as though, oh, the republic's fine, we're back in order. He would not have pushed prescriptions like Sulla, of course. Caesar didn't do that either. But I think it would have lasted a bit longer. But the truth of the matter is that Rome could only workably be administered. And the people, most importantly, their needs could only be addressed if there was a strong enough person at the top. The necessity for an emperor was manifest. And maybe Caesar wasn't the guy. He'd upset too many people, and they were too full of vainglory. And of course, he was assassinated. But it is slightly ironic, but also apropos to your question, that Augustus created what we call the empire, a new constitutional order in Rome that was probably very close to what Pompey would have created. In other words, there was, at least on the surface, but pretty much throughout Augustus' reign and those of other effective emperors, there was a good relationship between the emperor and the Senate, and the emperor did not rule with a heavy hand. And the general rituals and business of the Roman Republic seemed to continue without any kind of interruption. And so, therefore, I think the course was pretty clear. And Pompey would have just made it perhaps a little easier, but who knows? I mean, on Pompey's death, there would have been another succession crisis, another civil war, just like the ones that happened. I mean, the triumphal, well, the second triumvirate also split up and fought.
Right.
I mean, Antony fought Octavian, so that had to be finished. And so what essentially happened were civil wars that didn't get anywhere, and that made the republic more fractious, eventually turned into a constitutional process in and of itself for selecting the next emperor, which is actually, I think, why the Roman Empire survived so long.
Germanicus, in the 1st century BCE, talking about Pompey living, of course, there would have been no Cleopatra in a rug. There would have been no Cassius. There would have been no Cato's suicide. There would have been no Mark Antony club for drinking. There would have been so many things, and there wouldn't have been the end of the Ptolemies, although that was probably going to come anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If Pompey had lived, he would have been a roadblock to what happened, Cassius and Cleopatra.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
However, we are 1st century AD men, enjoying our cup of wine and speculating about the 21st century and the 1st century AD. And I thank you for listening. This is the Friends of History Debating Society, Pompey the Great. I'm John Batchelor.